Hello and welcome to FNS. I'm Son. I about said I'm father. I'm Son, and
And I'm father.
yeah, and we're father and son. That's a little bit different hearing me say that, but for good reason. Trust me. So today is going to be a little bit different than normal. We're not actually doing our typical podcast where we just kind of talk about a topic. Today we are discussing something that we kind of alluded to last week. No, it didn't go up last week. Because
we've alluded to it a couple times.
Yeah, but I'm
in
just
other episodes.
I'm an idiot for other stuff. But now we're going to discuss it, and that is the writing podcast. So Evan has been wanting to do this for a little while, and I thought it would be really cool to do as well. And so basically, Evan's going to discuss some things of his writing in depth, and to kind of give you the full scope of what it means to him, and I'm going to kind of be more of a background character in this equation and let him speak, and then when he asks me a question, I'll respond in turn, and so we're gonna start it right about now.
Yeah. Okay. So we're assuming basically that anyone listening, because pretty much everybody listening, unless somebody just I don't know randomly finds this podcast, they know that I'm a writer. Because the people listening to this follow me on social media, on Instagram and Twitter, and on those sites, I do occasionally make updates about my stories. If for whatever reason you're not familiar with the fact that I'm a writer, then you can always go onto my Instagram and you'll find posts about the titles and basic premises of my stories and whatnot. But now that we got that out of the way, one of the reasons I was really eager to join Jer and even starting a podcast was because I think it's very difficult to update people about my creative process via Instagram or other social media. Not just because there's not enough room to write everything I want to say, but also because there's no guarantee that what I say is permanent. The thing about being a writer or really any type of artist is that your position and approach changes pretty frequently. And the great thing about a podcast is that if I say something in one episode that I change my mind on a few episodes later, I can address that. I have done my best to consider everything I want to talk about in this particular episode, and so my hope is that I won't instantly change my mind about everything right after this episode is out, but who knows. And finally, to clarify, everything that I'm talking about has been written down. I'm reading off of a transcript right now, and I'm doing that because it's the only way to ensure that I talk about everything I want to and phrase everything the way I want to. Jer, of course, is not reading from a script. He's hearing all this, at least in this form, for the first time, and he'll respond to it however he sees fit. So let's get into it then.
Ad lib OP.
So, some of my stories are as follows: A Night on the Town, Fast Checkout, The Gap Year, and 1:37 a.m. More specifically, these are the stories that I have finished. But in fact, I've finished them multiple times each, and I'll explain that in a minute. But A Night on the Town was my first story. I started writing that when I was 15. I was far from ready to be a published writer at 15, but I still thought I wanted to publish before I left high school because I heard that the author of The Outsiders did it. So I thought I could too. As we all know, that didn't happen, but I wasn't broken up about it. I knew I had lots of time. But I did get more serious about publishing when I started college and attended some creative writing workshops. And I revisited some of my old ideas, especially A Night on the Town, because I'd always liked that one the best. And to be honest, that's still true in many ways. The story went through a few major drafts, and then I self-published it online through barnesandnoble.com. Super easy thing to do. Now, I'm not sure why I released A Night on the Town when I did, or why I released it the way I did. But what ended up happening is that I published a second edition of the story literally the same year as I published the first edition. Because it wasn't until after I released the first edition that I thought the story could actually use another draft or two. And as it turns out, I released a couple more stories, and I ended up feeling this way about almost everything I've written so far. I regret self-publishing when I did. To be clear, I don't regret choosing to self-publish instead of publish in the quote-unquote real way, because as it stands right now, in the grand scheme of things, I am a mediocre writer, not bad, but mediocre, and I'll get better as time goes on. But for now, I think the minimal reception that I get for my writing from self-publishing is adequate when taking the current quality of the work into account, which is a long-winded way of saying that I'm satisfied with my current small audience, which is literally only friends and acquaintances of mine who have, taken the time to read what I put out there. But the point is that I have kept working on the stories I've released even after I've released them. And at this point, I've now made enough changes to them that I think I've done all I can do with them. Who knows if that's true or not, but for the sake of argument, let's say it is, and that they're now officially done. I'm still left with an issue, which is this. How do I live with the knowledge that no one has read the final versions of my stories? Because they've been edited since I released them. So do I release new versions yet again? Because to tell the truth, I'm insecure about this. That would make a third edition of A Night on the Town, a third edition of The Gap Year, which has never been released by itself, but it has been released twice as part of two different stories, probably to its detriment. And then a second edition for the others, with the exception of Fast Checkout, which Jer and I talked about a few episodes ago. I do think it's my strongest story, and I've never really felt the need to make any significant changes to that one in particular. But the reason I'm insecure about this is because I feel like, surely everyone must be tired of hearing about these particular stories. Surely they're wondering, what's taken me so long to write about something new? A lot of writers, even in the old days of like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein novel, have released new additions to their stories, sometimes a couple years after they were originally published. And that ought to be empowering for me, but I do still feel like it's unprofessional and untalented for wanting to improve my stories and let them grow with me, even though I've already stated to my peers multiple times that they are finished. I don't know what I'm going to end up doing about this or how I'm going to proceed with self-publishing. And to tell you the truth, it may be a long time before I release any new stories because of this. Jer and I, one of our good friends, Archer, he's very talented with the whole graphic design thing, and he usually creates my book covers for me. And he, in fact, has a new cover for a short story collection by me that is mostly finished at this point. But I've been questioning all year whether or not I'm actually going to release that collection anytime soon. And it may be that Archer gets the go ahead to put out that design on his Instagram, because he, posts his art sometimes as well. He may get the go ahead to release that on its own, because it could be months or even a year or more before I actually can look at these news stories that I have and think to myself that I'm confident I can release them without feeling, man, I've released these, but I gotta rewrite them and release them again. Um, and so I don't know if that if anything in there particularly strikes you as something you can comment on, Jer, but that's kind of like my first bullet point there.
Hmm. Um, honestly, I kind of understand in some ways the feeling of like once you let something go, you want to take it back almost in a way and
Hmm.
maybe revise and adapt it because there's always going to be a sense of this isn't finished, you know?
Yeah.
As an artist in any capacity, you're a singer, you're an artist in the terms of drawing and painting, you're a theater person, you are a writer. Your work is an extension of yourself. And since you're always growing and morphing and changing, because your work being an extension of yourself, as you change, it almost seems as if you want to change the work along with you. And when you put as much of yourself into the writings that you do specifically, then of course you're going to want to change it more and more and more. That's why I think I don't really believe in changing writing after it's done personally. I don't.
Yeah, that's fair.
Because I feel like once you've written something or once you've created something and you've made it, I don't think there's anything wrong with making revised drafts of it. I don't think that's necessarily a wrong thing to do. I just personally believe that it's a part of who you were, not who you are. I
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
those drafts are a landmark, if you will, of what you were last week, a month ago, a year ago.
Hmm.
It really does depict and show your mental state in your heart and where you were at that time. And I think it's really good to be able to go back and look on top of those things and say, this is who I was, not who I am. And I feel like
Yeah.
whenever you keep rewriting something or trying to revise it, it's almost as if you're letting it grow along with you, which I think if the intention of it is to do that, then yeah, go ahead. If you want to make something like a blog post, or not really a blog post, but like maybe you title it or label it as something that's always growing, ever changing, like a book
Mm,
series or something like that, that you always are changing to adapt and conform to your current state of mind. But if your goal is to write a book, um, or even an art piece to draw an art piece, or an act piece to draw an act, I think all of those should remain as they are, static, um,
mhm.
so you can go back and look on them. But that's just my personal opinion on the subject. That's nothing to
No, yeah,
put
yeah.
bearing on when you
And
read.
it's and well, and the thing is that it's difficult for me to decide, like, I wasn't thinking per se when I first released a story, what I wanted the purpose to be as far as that goes. Did I want it to be static or ever changing?
Mhm,
Um, and obviously, I mean, I think there's limits. For one thing, if I were only rewriting old stories and never writing anything new, then I would say that's an issue.
mhm,
But I am writing new things occasionally. It's harder to keep, people updated about stories that are in progress, so I don't usually talk about those. But they do exist. I am working on other things. So I think creatively, I'm not like, keeping myself in a ditch, I guess you'd
mhm.
say.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing is that while I do like the idea of editing and revising stories, obviously I wouldn't carry that on forever.
Mhm,
Especially because it's kind of similar to what you say about those stories being a representation of where I'm at or where I was at a specific point in my life, is because you get too far detached from that point and then you're changing the entire story, on a fundamental level.
mhm,
Uh, but, those stories were written and released in their first, second editions, literally just last year. So when I was revising them over, you know, the last year, or so,
mhm,
um, I didn't feel like I was detached from those points in my life. But certainly, you give it a couple more years at the most, and I wouldn't want to do it.
mhm.
But that's big issue number one. But let's just move on to the second one because I'm honestly
Okay.
more interested in this one.
Alright.
Um, and actually, I'm glad that you said it. Because my my introduction is literally this: my stories are extensions of me. And that's exactly what you just said. But they're also not extensions of me, and that sounds like a contradiction, but it's true because there
Paradox.
could be, yeah, well, there could be two sentences sitting right next to each other, okay? And one could be an opinion that I hold in real life, while another is something that I made up and do not agree with, and I'm only using it to serve the story. Now, I could be wrong. I don't know how you approach reading a book,
Mhm,
but from what I can tell, it's sort of an unspoken thing that nobody really thinks about that. They tend to read the story and assume everything they're reading is what the writer believes. They don't tell themselves that word for word, but I think it's there.
mhm,
And I think that because it's what I automatically do, even as a writer myself, and I have to remind myself not to do it when I read a story. It's just a sort of subconscious thing that I'm reading the thoughts of another person, and therefore these thoughts are what the other person, actually believes. Um, and I think this is what part of what makes it easy for an outside party to potentially screw up a story. The destruction of art by audiences and even other artists happens all the time. Every individual approaches a story with their own lifetime's worth of biases and opinions that no writer really stands a chance against. That in and of itself is okay. But the idea of a reader automatically making certain assumptions about how the writing relates to the author and his life is a problem for me in particular because it means I can't write everything I want. I have to censor myself constantly, not just from obvious content like graphic language or sexual references, but broader things, ideas and principles and themes that those who are close to me might be surprised to even know I think about at all. Because once you write something down, it's kind of taken as concrete fact coming from you until proven otherwise. And so I have two desires in hand that are impossible to really reconcile. On the one hand, for example, people swear, and so I'm compelled to write stories that are full of swear words. But on the other hand, I've censored myself because I feel compelled to represent the gospel as best I can. Now, Jared and I had a whole conversation before in the first episode of this podcast, excuse me, about swear words in particular, and the fact that a lot of Christians cuss, not necessarily because they think it's okay, because it comes naturally. But the unfortunate truth is that even non-Christians view cussing as a bad thing insofar as they assume we Christians aren't allowed to do it, and that anyone who cusses and says they are a Christian must be lying. And I think that goes double for any discussion of sex. Now, up front, I'm not going to be so stupid as to think that the desire to dwell on sex is not because I'm a 20-year-old guy. That's mostly the reason. However, as far as I can tell, that doesn't discount the fact that sex plays a very large role in an individual's life and society as a whole, whether that's the act itself or the simple idea of it. And given that the majority of my stories are about young men and women, I can't see a different, more realistic goal for them to share with each other besides sex, because I certainly don't find that the young men and women I know in real life have any other goal that's quite so, clear and unchanging. And I don't want to ruin a path God potentially has set for me by writing something that's viewed as immoral. But unfortunately, I have very few ideas that don't in some way involve immorality. Now, you could say that that's because that's all there is in the world for me to see. You could say that's the devil trying to tempt me to use my talent for his own ends. But for what it's worth, I think there really is potentially ways that a story full of sex can be used for good. And when I say full of sex, to be clear, I'm not advocating for writing sex scenes. I'm advocating for writing scenes about sex because there is a difference there. And I feel like, for example, I could call out the prominence of sex in the lives of many Christian teens and unmarried people, for example, and point out the fact that they have a much greater focus on sex and other immoral things instead of God, even though they still occasionally mention God and go to church every week. And really, that's what some of my characters have done already to a, much smaller degree. But that's basically the definition of a lukewarm Christian. And I'm absolutely interested in calling out lukewarm Christians, especially because I've seen so many in my time, and I used to be one. And I've seen, maybe not firsthand, but close enough to firsthand, what happens when adults and figures of guidance ignore sex completely and pretend like it's not an issue, or not at least a big issue, in teenagers' lives. And Jer knows why, but the other listeners will just have to believe me when I say that, really, I take this very seriously. I'm not just talking to hear my own voice. Sex is good in the right context, but it is potentially a danger otherwise. And we don't like to acknowledge that in today's world. We like, everybody to be able to do whatever they want. Though, even in today's world, sex is still a private affair insofar as nobody just talks about it at random unless they're joking around. But I do think discussions of sex in a serious manner matter, including 1, what not to do, 2, what to do at certain times, and 3, and maybe most importantly, what to do if you end up doing one of the things you shouldn't have done. That in particular is the one that I never heard from any teacher or guidance counselor or youth pastor growing up. At the school Jared and I went to, I think there was a real, hellfire and brimstone attitude instead of real advice. And I'm not saying that a book is the perfect solution to this, but at least it's public or meant to be public, and it could potentially be accessible to someone who needed it. And I'm not talking solely about my books. This could be for any book. But again, in terms of me specifically, because of the fact that audiences automatically assume every opinion a writer puts down in a story is something he condones, unless maybe it's the opinion of the story's bad guy, which could be an exception because he's the bad guy. I don't know how much of an option writing that kind of story is for me, especially for someone who's as involved with a church as I am. So I feel, double the limitations that most writers have. I can't ever really hope that words will be enough to truly express what I think and feel. That's the problem of every writer. But I also don't even feel as though I have access to all the words in existence to begin with. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not reaching any, concrete decision on this yet, but that's just something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. So I don't know, Jared, what's your opinion on that?
A saying went through my head when you first talked about ignorance, and ignorance of the immoral is the essence of ignorance itself.
Mm,
Um, to completely deny or attempt to avoid immorality as a whole doesn't solve the problem. It only furthers to increase the issue, you know? And so I think
yeah,
that whenever you say, like we were talking about, or you were discussing, how specifically in our lives and in a lot of situations we're in, where as a writer, as a Christian, you feel that it's hard sometimes to discuss and depict things that are more immoral in nature. And I feel before it was, around Jesus' time, it was almost a bad thing if you didn't call it immorality or didn't discuss immorality. And it's almost
mm,
become to this point where immorality to discuss immorality, to talk about it whatsoever, even in a wrong context or a context of healing, is considered immorality.
yeah,
It's almost as if you equate the talking about it, discussion of it, to the actual action itself.
yeah,
And a lot of people don't understand that when you're discussing something or you're actually, you know, expressing what you feel on the subject, you must suddenly feel that yourself. So if,
right,
for example, you are talking about sex and you're talking about teenagers having a lot of sex in a book, um, even if it doesn't depict the sex scenes whatsoever, even if it's not graphical in any nature, it just talks about it in a normal light, and they have done it, and maybe some of them regret it. A lot of them probably do. Um, but automatically, it seems as if that's a norm, even if the commentary on it afterwards is something more. Hey, why is this something that we go through? Why do we have to do this? Where does it say in society that we have to be these animals that are always going at it? It's like,
yeah,
why can't it be something beautiful between a man and a woman?
yeah,
And it's almost as if just even starting the conversation is hell itself.
mhm,
And I feel something that I kind of found interesting is a lot of the times where you said that sometimes the opinion of the villain is viewed as the only time where somebody like an author can discuss something without seeming like the bad guy himself as well, without it being an extension of their own thought. A lot of
mhm,
the times the thoughts of that villain are those intrusive thoughts that we think ourselves, you know?
right,
I mean, look at the movie The Joker, right? Not even Heath Ledger, that situation.
mhm,
Look at just the Joker itself. Me and Evan watched this movie a long time ago, and we were discussing possibly doing like a movie review podcast at some point. Um, but I'll kind of go into it now. Is if you look at the movie The Joker, the reason why it's so disturbing on a fundamental level is because of how hard it tackles those things, and you're supposed to look at the villain and feel spite for him, but you can't. As you
yeah,
look at the way Joaquin Phoenix destroyed himself, right, and was destroyed by the world around him, you try desperately to hate everything that he is, and you can't. I mean, you might not like it, you might not agree with any of the things he does, but you can't. You're almost forced to have sympathy for him in a way that
well,
because
you just, like, you feel disgusting afterwards, I think is the
Mhm.
word that you and I both
Yeah.
agreed we felt when we were walking out of the theater, and I
Mhm.
think the reason for that is, um, I think everyone deep down has the potential to go that bad,
Mhm.
and it was basically a film that calls that out about us,
Mhm.
like, the character that became the Joker had some, mental issues already,
Mhm.
but, still the point I think, the movie was making was, we could all be a few bad days away from doing
Mhm.
something extremely rash and extremely, evil if we
Yeah.
don't watch out.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you look at I know the lines me I know that that line is memed a lot. Like, what do you get when you cross a mentally what is it? What's the word? A
Oh,
mentally
it's like, what do you get when you cross the mentally ill person with
loner
the
with a
society that doesn't care about him
about him.
or
You
treats him
get
like
what you
garbage?
you get what you deserve, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um and that No, I mean that line specifically is something that draws people to it. You know, it's like the voice of the villain is typically the intrusive thoughts of the person. He's got louder. Oh my gosh.
I can't hear him.
Okay, but
I mean,
so the
maybe your
voice of the
mic.
villain is typically more. It's more evident than you think. Like even though it's thought of as the one part that's not like the opinion of the writer, a lot of the times it actually secretly somewhat is. You know, at least in part of what the writer feels or believes. You know,
Sure, yeah.
and it kind of draws upon the problems of the human psyche. And so, no, but I completely I completely understand where you're coming from, sort of, with that almost have to censor yourself. I just think that I kind of went the opposite direction in some ways because I feel like I need to carry a torch for Christ, you know, in those regards. I'm not under the same conditions as you. Of course, I don't work for a church, so I don't have
Right.
to have as much as my image to be maintained. But I still bear the image of God. You know, I still bear the image of Christ. I'm still supposed to be a light of sorts, you know, for him, almost like a conduit. And
Mhm.
do I meet that all the time? No, but I also feel like I like to educate people that are uneducated on the subject more so than others, right? So
Mm.
if somebody thinks that I'm not being a good Christian and they call me out on it, I'm like, yeah, you're right. I'm not a good Christian. I don't believe in such thing as a good Christian. And then
Yeah.
we discuss the situation. I don't think it's proper. I don't think I should do it that way. But I also think that right now it's where I'm at. And if somebody confronts
But
me on
it's
that, yeah,
also like I don't know what the proper way to do it would be, but
I
it's
don't think there really
also
is. But
seems like an important conversation though,
it is.
because it's a reason that I think so many non-Christians look at Christians
Mhm,
and think, they're not really doing anything different, so why should I,
mhm,
do that myself? And because the thing is that Christians aren't supposed to immediately become these
mhm,
pure holy beings. We're still
mhm,
very sinful, and I believe very strongly that there's only one guideline for
mhm.
your soul to be saved. You believe
Yeah.
in Jesus as your savior, and that's it. That's a
Mhm.
bare minimum approach, and obviously you should
Yeah.
strive for more than that.
Mhm.
But like, we're not going to hell just because you and I have both cussed before.
Yeah, exactly. And I
Like that
think
that's just not how it works. And some
yeah.
people, I think it is how it works.
That they do. I've had some interesting conversations with people that believe that just because I wasn't baptized immediately after I was saved, that I wasn't a Christian or baptized in their church specifically.
Mm,
And they took verses out of context, of course, and thought that the baptism that it was speaking about when you're saved and you're baptized, they immediately equated that to baptism of the water, and so they think that being baptized by water suddenly your dad um nothing, just being super loud. um and they suddenly immediately equate that with you know being with the blood of Christ physically, and I don't want to call him out completely, but that's just something that really peeves me off as that adding on to the Bible, adding on to what's already there and trying to create extra guidelines to make it harder for people to get in. It's hard enough already,
yeah. Yeah.
but it's this exclusivity that's there, and it is exclusive. Don't get me wrong. The Bible is not the Bible, but Christianity is an extremely exclusive thing to be able to get into, and it's nothing by our own. It's because it's nothing by our own accord that we can do it. It's nothing that
Mm,
we do that grants us any kind of special place in society or special place in life. It's simply the fact that we were loved by a God that wanted to love us,
mhm.
and we knew that we weren't worth anything. We couldn't work our way up. So, but all that to say that people tend to get the wrong image of Christians in a certain way, and all they see is people that believe that they're too high and mighty for everyone else, look at their nose down at people, and think that they're all that in a bag of chips, as well as being very hypocritical in nature, right?
Right. Right.
And then whenever an actual Christian does behave differently in a different light, and they're positive, they're happy people, but they still screw up and they still have issues. But they are willing to define what's right and wrong. A lot of Christians define what's right without expressing their own wrongs. But I personally, as a Christian, think that when you can define what's right and wrong by understanding what's in your heart in the gospel, as well as being able to call somebody out on what's wrong and standing up for what you believe in, that's the difference. I think that person's different. That person's different as a Christian. That's what I think that is. I don't think it's looking down at your nose at people. That's not being different as a Christian. That's being a douchebag. So
yeah, for sure.
But I don't know, man. I guess all that to say, just simply loving God is a lot more than just thinking you're all that.
Yeah. And so, we talk about, it's important to spend a lot of time on that, but again, I haven't really reached a, public solution for this particular issue, because as long as I work at a church in particular, I'm not going to want to potentially ruin my ability to witness for Christ. At the same time, I'm always going to want people to read the most honest versions of my stories, but for the moment they can't. But now that I say that, I will say that there's sort of a private solution that I have to this that I'll explain, that I've never actually talked to anybody about. But the truth is that I have actually written 2 different versions of every story that I have released. Everyone I know has access to one story, while I keep another version of that same story hidden from everyone except myself. They're on my computer. This allows me to write whatever I want, while at the same time having something different to show people, even if it isn't the true version. And in a selfish way, that helps me feel good about, anyone potentially saying something, incorrect about a story that I've written. They might think it means one thing when it really means something else, because I've given them a false version of that story, their opinion is probably wrong anyway. Again, that's super childish of me, but that sort of stems from me being very possessive of my stories. And I'm not really a death of the author guy. I think that while an audience can find their own significance inside a book by approaching it with their own experiences, and that's totally cool, that should be allowed, I think the author should also be allowed to be a prominent voice in stating the true intention and the actual meaning behind the book, which I realize there's flaws to that argument for some people. It's really a whole other conversation that we don't need to get into. But I think that line of thinking is part of why I do feel partially okay with no one reading the real versions of my stories. But ultimately, in a perfect world, for me, they would be able to read what I write first and not what I edit and water down.
Yeah. It was not perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So now we'll get into the third point here of what I want to talk about. And some of what I've been discussing relates to this or feeds into this, and has helped to make me feel the things I'm going to talk about, but it's really also its own issue. And the fact is this: there have been days, especially in the last, we'll say, year or so, when I felt writing is becoming dangerously close to being a very impersonal activity for me. And I've mentioned this to you before. Just because I have to write so often for school, and having to write something you don't have any real interest in is kind of a chore. I really only love writing if I'm writing for the heck of it, because I want to. There have also been days when I've been left wondering if I'm starting to run out of ideas for writing. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have other creative ideas that just wouldn't work as a story, but might work as something else. This is a big reason why I started the Evco Productions channel. It wasn't just that I was stuck in quarantine this summer and had nothing to do. That was a lot of it. But it's the fact that I have a lot of ideas that won't work as stories, but might work as videos. And you and everyone else will see this to be true, especially this winter when the boys come back and we start making new videos. Because the ones that we've made so far are kind of just scratching the surface. A lot of them, even the funny ones like Coke Addiction, for example, that was made up, on the spot. But I've started to write actual, miniature scripts, because some of what we're going to start doing are real ideas that I've had for all this to say that I'm at a very different creative stage than I was last year. It's not that I'm losing interest in writing. I'm always going to be writing. I can't stress that enough. But I'm rapidly losing interest in making an effort to share my writing, because I feel like creatively I'm reaching a point where I'm exploring new ways to express myself, and easier ways to express myself, both with the videos and with this podcast. Just kind of all that stuff and in general. And it's very rare that I feel the egotistical side of myself wanting a lot of validation these days. And whenever it does, I can get that just by posting something on social media and getting a handful of likes, and then it goes away. Because the truth is, I don't care about leaving a legacy as an artist. I think if you've written something you love, you're a success. It might be fun if other people recognize you, but that shouldn't be your ultimate validation. And my goal is just simply to write as much of what is floating around in my head and in my heart as possible before I'm gone. And if that means self-publishing stories or maybe one day publishing for real, I will know when that day comes. For now, I'm content to be writing really just for myself. Or maybe I'm even writing for someone I don't know yet. I've always, in particular, loved the idea of reading my stories aloud to my future wife or a kid of mine when they're old enough. I think that's a really particularly beautiful image that's been painted in my head that I do hope, God will allow me to have. And I know for sure, even now, that I want to be a part of an image and an experience like that a lot more than I want to be a published author. And to tell you the truth, at this particular point in time, I'm just going to flat out say it. I don't want to be a published author much at all, which may, sound surprising to some people, may even be disappointing to some people. But that's just kind of the case. That's where I'm at.
Yeah. I can see where you're coming from with that, man. Like, sometimes the things that you keep inside, you want to keep inside for a reason and only happen for specific years.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yeah.
things that I've told you that I probably won't tell anybody else. Not necessarily because they don't deserve to hear it, but because it's something that it's a part of who I am, and I'm not ready to let everyone else know that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that can go the same for writing. I mean, there's even like with small little like goofy things. Like if I wrote a short story when I was younger, right? I might show it to somebody else, or like a poem, and I might show it to somebody else that I truly trust with it. But giving a part of yourself over to somebody else, no matter how little it is always a difficult thing to do, you know? And
Yeah.
I guarantee you understand that because you just said you did. But a lot of people don't get that.
Yeah.
Even if you're an open book, that doesn't mean that everyone gets to read like the other books that you've written, So
Right. Yeah.
um
That's the funny thing is because I
mhm.
always tell people that, me as a person, that I'm an open book. And then I'll have people tell me like, no, you aren't. I don't know anything about you. And I'm like, well, that's just because you don't ask. Like, I'll tell you. You
Yeah,
just have to
exactly.
actually bring it up.
We've
I'm not going
discussed
to
this
just,
before.
yeah.
Um we never did it on the podcast, but you're never gonna open yourself up to somebody just instantly unless but if
Yeah.
they ask you, I mean, you're not nothing to hide. It's
Mhm.
more like it's like you're an open book, but every third letter is gone, and they have to ask like you what like letter or word that was, and you're like, oh, it's this one,
Yeah.
right?
It's more of it's a fill in the blank book. It's a
It's
choose your own
fill in
adventure.
the blank. Choose your own. 12 beers at Chili's. Let's do
But
bad.
just to I don't know that reference. I'm just gonna
What? You don't know? Okay, I'll show you the video later. It's a Carson reference.
okay. But I'll just state one more time that because I feel it's necessary, that nothing I'm saying here is absolutely final. And I realize that it could potentially sound to people like I've given up on a certain path or two that I could take with my creative interests, because I haven't.
Mhm.
Every door is still an option. I can always, as I said, end up changing my mind about anything I've said so far.
Mhm.
This is just about how I foresee things going based on where I am right now in life. And life is
Mhm.
always changing. I'm always changing. So I'm sure some of the things I've said here will change. And it may be that we, do a writing podcast every other season of FNS just to keep things consistent and
Mhm.
keep catching everyone up.
Yeah.
Um, but as it goes, that was about, I don't know if that was a full hour, but that was about everything that I needed to cover.
Was about 43 minutes, I believe. So
Okay.
42
Went
minutes.
went faster than I thought it would.
Yeah.
But
More because this one I was I honestly was listening to you more than anything else. Like I didn't have much to say.
No, yeah, and I appreciate that though,
Yeah.
because that's really what this is about. Is because again, the reason I wanted so badly to do this the first time you said to me, "Hey, we should," you were like, "Yo, dude, we should start a podcast," and I was like, "Oh, frick yeah!" And the reason for that was because just because the only other way I can update people about my writing process and my creative, approach and stuff like that is through Instagram posts, which limit your words, and nobody wants to read that long a post when they're scrolling Instagram anyway. Um, and so I just needed I needed a different way to inform people about where I'm at right now because I haven't given a clear update. I feel like really all year. It has been a good year for me creatively. I think not to brag for those who have been
Not to brag.
negatively affected by by the COVID situation, but I've been loving it personally
I've been
because
loving. Yeah, you're an antisocial piece of trash.
I'm
What do
just
you
saying
mean?
I've
Of
got
course you have.
hey, I've gotten a lot done. Okay, that's all that's all I'm gonna say. But
Don't let anyone ever tell you that being antisocial is unproductive.
it sure as frick isn't, dude.
I
Because
I
I've
love hearing you use the word frick because it's just like
well, okay, I'll tell you something.
the word sounds so weird in your mouth specifically.
Well, okay, that's the thing though, because other people have told me that. But the thing is even before, like we've had the cussing debate a couple times, and frick is obviously a filler word. But I was using that word like way back in third or fourth grade
It
before I
still
even knew.
sounds so weird in your mouth specifically.
I'm just telling you, I've literally said frick my entire life.
I've been using the filler word for fuck my entire life.
Hey, I'm not like other people, Jer. I'm built different, okay?
I'm built different.
Don't you freaking forget it.
No one does it like me no more. That's why I'm the realest in the game.
That's god dang straight, dude. Let me tell you.
So you won't say fuck, but you'll say god dang.
Well, I didn't say